I work for a company that receives donated clothing and goods that we give to those in need, mostly orphan children and low-income families. We drive 5-ton trucks around the province and pick up materials from houses and businesses. We get a list at the beginning of the day with addresses, phone numbers, names, and special instructions. Yesterday, I was on a run in our city and had a stop in what is nicknamed the Reserve, which is essentially a 20-block radius of low-income families and is the population center for our First Nation locals, hence the name. This area has an extremely high crime rate. The house on my list was just on the southern edge of the reserve, located across the street from a set of train tracks and a field. What was odd was that the list only had an address and special instructions, no name or number. This is the first time I had seen something like that in the 6 years I've been doing this. The special instructions simply stated, "Empty house, come inside." When I arrived at the house, I was nervous as the house looked abandoned. The front door was missing, there were several broken windows, and the yard looked as though it had not been groomed for decades. A jungle of tall grass, weeds, and trees obscured a dilapidated building. Needless to say, I was on edge. In my experience, these kinds of houses were usually owned by drug users, so I assumed that whoever lived there was a drug user. I made a quick call to the office to make sure I had the right address, and it was confirmed. I parked the truck and made my way to the empty hole that was the front door. I knocked on the door frame, but there was no answer, so I stepped inside to see that the entire place was trashed. The place was completely bare, but it was filled with graffiti and holes in the walls. All of the light fixtures were broken, and there were puddles of waters from the rain the day before. I called out into the dark house and received no answer, so I walked into the next room and found a piece of paper on the floor. The paper was standard printing paper, with a message printed onto it, which is strange, as there was no computer around, and I doubt the place had any power. The message simply stated, "I'm in the basement." I found a doorway to what I assume was the basement, but it was pitch black down there, and many of the steps were broken. At this point, my brain was screaming at me to get out, but I decided to do my job and call out to whoever was down there. I announced my presence and who I worked for, and asked if anyone was down there. There was silence for a few moments, and then I heard an older man's voice coming from the darkness saying,
"I'm down here."
For some reason, this made the hair on my neck stand up, and I decided it was time to leave. I called out and said, "It's too dark down there, and these steps are broken. I'm afraid I can't come down, sir. If you want, you can call our office and reschedule the appointment for another day." There was silence for a few moments, and just as I was about to repeat myself, I heard the man say,
"Don't worry about the steps, just come down here."
At this point, I normally would have just repeated what I had said, but I was in flight mode and I wanted out of there now. So instead of giving them a cheerful farewell, I speed walked to the front door and was walking onto the front steps when I heard the man's voice one more time saying,
"Where are you going? Come back."
I broke into a sprint and got into my car as fast as possible. I put it in drive and took off. I looked back at the house and half expected to see someone standing in the window, but instead, there was no one. I called my boss and told him what happened. He said that I should have never gone inside. Today he told me that a few years ago, they had 2 drivers go to some abandoned houses, and they were robbed by some members of a gang. He said those guys told a very similar story, except I wasn't robbed. With this in mind, I really do wonder if I was walking into some kind of trap, or if the guy was some kind of serial killer. Maybe he was just a lonely man looking for some company, but I wasn't keen on finding out. I ended up putting the address on our do not pick up list, so no drivers would go there anymore. He may have been an honest man trying to make a donation, but I was not going to risk the lives of my coworkers to find out. This is a story that happened to my parents. My parents are decent people who have never bothered anyone. They've always kept to themselves, and they never had any trouble with the neighbors. One day they're at home watching TV and the phone rings. My dad picks it up, and it's just someone breathing on the line. He says, "Hello? Hello?" a few times, but they don't answer and hang up. Fast forward a few days, and my mom is home alone. I had gone out to a friend's house, and all of my siblings were out with my dad. The phone rings again, and my mom picks it up. Whoever this guy was started telling her that he knew she was home alone and threatened to rob and rape her. My mom was a bit shocked at this, but she just put it down to a prankster going through the phone book. Then this guy starts telling her that he can see her, and that he knows she's in the living room. We only have 2 phones, one upstairs and one in the living room. He starts describing what she's wearing, and my mother freaks out and tells him never to ring back or she would call the police. Here's the weirdest part. Our house is pretty private. We live in a row of attached houses, all with their own private back gardens and 7 to 8 foot tall walls around them, and the only way you can see into the living room is from the back garden. Or, if you're looking over the back garden wall, but my mom swears she saw no one from the living room window at that time. She was pretty freaked out and rang my dad, and he darted home. Then a few days later, the same thing happened. My dad picked up the phone this time. They start asking all sorts of personal questions, and then they say my dad's name, which starts to freak him out. They continue to say stuff like, "Is that your wife beside you?" And then they start threatening to do all sorts of horrific things to him and my mother, which I would rather not repeat, but it involved more rape threats, not just to my mother, but to my father as well. They threatened to tie him up and make him watch, and vice versa. My dad is one of those usually laid-back types. Like I said, he rarely wants to hassle people, and he keeps to himself most of the time. But my mom and brother said that he lost it. It seemed like he was pretty close to reaching through the phone and ripping this asshole's throat out, telling this guy that he'd kill him if he ever rang again or touched any of his family. Anyway, having enough of this, my parents rang the police and they came out to the house. Unfortunately, the calls were made from a withheld phone number, but the police did what they could. But we never found out who was making those calls. Thankfully, they never got another call like that again. But I will never forget how hysterical my poor mother was that day. To this day, she still won't answer the phone if it's a number she doesn't know, and she has a huge, purebred German Shepherd to keep her company, who really doesn't take kindly to strangers in her garden. This story is about 3 years old, from a time when I was living alone in a somewhat sketchy area of a major US city. I was 23 at the time, and I'm very small. I absolutely adored my studio apartment. It was located on the 4th floor of an old red brick building built in 1912, complete with a rickety fire escape and an elevator with layers of old paint that had peeled off over the years, exposing a patchwork time capsule of gaudy taste. The walls were thin, the carpet blue, tacky, and well-worn. The doors were relatively new and cheap. They may as well have been made of plywood. But it had a great city feel about it. located in the most populous part of the city, with tall buildings and Art Deco theaters surrounding it, and an illuminating nightfall with freestanding neon signs and spotlit billboards. I felt free, and I felt alive. I lived there for 2 years. I had a few incidents, however, in and around the building that should have been indicators that I needed to break my lease, including a neighbor exposing himself to me on the fire escape one night as I was smoking a cigarette, and even worse still, when I was beaten and mugged for my laptop 1 block away. Like many of the building's tenants, I had seen hard times before, and moving anywhere safer on my income seemed nearly impossible. I was barely getting by. So I convinced myself to wait it out and everything would be okay. Until it wasn't. Normally, I'd take the train and go dancing Friday nights. This was probably the only Friday night I decided to stay in. My friend Homer was over watching a movie, and another friend, Justin, was staying with me until he could find a room. Despite whatever random turn of events led to this night, I am very grateful they were there with me. I lived alone, and my neighbors knew that, but I knew most of my neighbors. They were mostly struggling actors and artists, a few immigrant families, and some elderly people. They all took care of each other, and none of them, aside from the creep who exposed himself to me, were cause for any concern. I should state here, before I continue with my story, that the creep I just mentioned was not responsible for the following events. He couldn't have been, because he was shorter than me at 5'6" and barely spoke English. At around 10 p.m., I rolled out some blankets and yoga mats for the guys to crash on. My bed wasn't much better, a foam futon mattress topper lying on the floor. It is worth mentioning here, my bed could only face the door/hallway so that I would not be blocking the kitchen. Also worth mentioning is that my apartment looked out onto the street, and any lights on or off are visible from the street below. At 10 p.m., we hit the lights and called it a night. As I lied in bed, staring at the door, trying to fall asleep, something catches my eye. Remember I mentioned the fire escape right outside my apartment door? Well, tenants often walk to the fire escape to smoke cigarettes, weed, or drink beer. Because of its proximity to my door and open windows, I can hear conversations on the fire escape. The usual suspects who party up there normally brought music with them. Tonight, it was silent, but for a pair of feet that kept walking in front of my door, their shadow exposed by a fluorescent hallway. My mind began racing, and all I could think was, nobody is up there drinking tonight. Why is someone going back and forth in the hallway? Wait, is someone pacing in front of my door? I felt a jab in my side. Do you see that? Homer whispered. I wasn't going to say anything, Justin chimed in. They were both still awake. Then to our collective horror, the feet stopped directly in front of my door. About 20 seconds later, a second pair joined them. The second man was huge. He must have been over 6 foot tall because the shadow of his body eliminated the light around half of my doorframe. I realized he was standing in front of the side that locks. Then, more whispering. This time, however, from the other side of the door. We couldn't make out any of it, except one telling the other, shh. Then, the knocking began. It was light, almost friendly knock. The same type of knock I use when visiting a friend's house to let them know that I'm at their door. Immediately, I froze. None of my neighbors ever come to my door. Only my landlord, and only during business hours. I wasn't expecting company, nor did I have the type of friends who show up unannounced. My building locked from the outside, and you need to be a resident or have a key to get in. I began to wonder, do they know I'm home? I was usually gone at this time on weekends. I thought of calling the police, and then remembered using my phone in a building with walls so thin you can hear your neighbor's TV programs, and thought that it wasn't a great idea. Besides, how would they even get into the building? I sure as hell wasn't going to open the door. There was more knocking, playful this time. They were taunting me. Homer and I sat frozen in fear as Justin walked to my kitchen and grabbed 3 knives. He handed them to each of us. I had never felt as trapped and helpless as I did at that moment. There were more whispers on the other side of the door, and suddenly,
I know you're in there. Jane, I know you are home.
my heart fell when I realized he knew my name. Then we heard scratching, and my lock jiggling. Immediately, Homer half leapt, half stumbled to the door. With the stealth of a ninja, he locked the deadbolt and chain, silently and quickly. All I could think was, they are trying to take the handle off my door. And then, it stopped. I looked at the boys. Nobody goes near the door, I remember saying. I have no idea what I did the following moment. I grew up around domestic violence and have a bit of a habit of blacking out certain memories or events that disturb me as a defense mechanism. Perhaps it is because of this that I was able to fall asleep that night. When I woke up the next morning, I finally opened my door. A screw was missing from the handle, the other, thankfully, stripped beyond removal. On the floor was a pile of cigarette butts and ashes. They must have waited outside my door, second-guessing my being home and waiting until the clubs ended. They waited for me, in front of my own door. Right after college, I was living in a ground-floor corner apartment in an old building. It was a great location, had beautiful hardwood floors, and I almost never saw my neighbors. One window was at ground level, and was always kept locked. The other faced a tiny back parking lot, was directly above the sunken stairs to the basement, and had a large fan in it, wedged in with a block of wood. It seemed safe to have the window open on hot nights with just a fan in it because I assumed it would be difficult, although not impossible, to climb onto the ledge over the stairway. One night, while my roommate was away traveling, I had just started to fall asleep and suddenly awoke to see the silhouette of a man squatting in my window removing the fan. I used to sleep naked, so I grabbed the top sheet and ran toward my front door. I heard him jump into the room and follow me. When I got to the door, there was a deadbolt and a chain on it, plus the locked doorknob itself. I frantically twisted the locks but couldn't get them all open at once. I could hear the guy coming down the hall. Just as he came up behind me, I finally got them all open and started out into the well-lit but empty hallway, slamming the door behind me. There was only one other apartment on the floor which belonged to a midwife who was never home at night. I started banging on the midwife's door and was shocked when she answered immediately. "A guy crawled into my window and he's right behind me." She pulled me in and slammed the door. She then called the police, poured me a big glass of wine, and told me it was her first night at home in a month. When the cops, who both looked about 17 years old, showed up, they were not helpful.
From the looks of your apartment, he wasn't here to rob you. Yeah.
Thanks, Officers Beavis and Butthead. The next night, the supervisor found me an air conditioner and nailed it into the window frame. And until I was able to find another apartment and move out, I slept with my friend's corgi at the foot of the bed. Even after moving, I really didn't feel safe again for several months. This happened a few years ago while I was living with my parents while trying to find a place of my own after coming back from college. I am a 26-year-old female, and this happened when I was 21. My parents lived about 10 miles outside of a smallish town, in what many people would consider the boondocks. They had a big home on 2 acres, and there were other homes around them on similar land parcels that made up a small housing community, just further apart than normal. I'd say about 30 to 35 homes altogether. My parents' house was at the outside corner on the edge of this community, with the main and pretty much only road right behind them leading back to town or deeper into the desert. The HOA wouldn't allow block fences to be put up to distinguish property lines. I think the reasoning was that they wanted to keep the landscape as picturesque as possible, or something stupid like that. But we had a lot of problems with people parking on the road behind our house at night and walking the 100 yards to our porch and stealing things like lawnmowers, quads, tools, etc. Well, one weekend, my parents were out of town and I had the huge house to myself. I came home from work at around 10 p.m. as usual and opened the door, closed the door, locked it, and stepped to the house alarm keypad, which was beeping for the allotted time to enter the code before it started going off in sirens throughout the house. Now, this alarm is not connected to anything that alerts the police. Its sole purpose is to alert us if anyone tries to enter or exit. I disarmed it and then pressed stay, so that it would set without the motion sensors and only go off if a window or door was opened. So here's the thing. The alarm won't arm if a door or window is open, and we have had problems with a sensor not connecting on the door I had just used. That's why I locked the deadbolt immediately, because it shifts it into place and allows the alarm to be set. But I was looking at the locked door next to me, thinking, what the heck is going on? So I open and close and lock the door again and try to see if the alarm will set. It doesn't. As I'm calling my brother who lives 10 minutes away to troubleshoot the stupid alarm with me on the phone, I notice that it starts flashing the number 32, which indicates which door or window is open. The number 32 belongs to the back door near the dining area. But the creepy thing is that the alarm was set when I walked in 2 minutes beforehand, so the door had to have just been opened. I'm still on the phone with my brother as the pieces start clicking in my brain, and I tell him to get over here ASAP because I think someone's in the house. As I hang up the phone so they can call my other brothers, who all live within 10 minutes as well, I hear a door shut quietly, so I set the alarm for stay so I'll know if they try to leave. The alarm immediately sets as usual. I carry a gun with me in my car, but I never leave it in the car overnight, and I usually just carry it into the house with me when I come home at night. I backed myself into a corner where I could view all the doorways and windows and kept the gun at my side while waiting for my brothers who would be arriving shortly. All 4 brothers arrived and entered different doors, and the alarm starts going off with a loud siren noise, and one brother asks if I'm okay. I said yes, but I think someone's still here. Then we heard another brother yell for help, so we haul ass around the house to see a tall figure sprinting out from the patio door across the lawn towards the main road. He had a big head start, and as we all chased after him, we saw him fire up a car we didn't notice before in the darkness and hightail it out of there. We filed a report with the police, but nothing ever came of it. I don't know his intentions because nothing was taken or disturbed. We later figure out he had hid under the staircase leading down to our basement when he finally got inside, because we found muddy footprints that stopped about 5 steps down. The man had to have been watching the house, or me, or both, in order to time his stealthy entrance. I didn't realize how shaken I was until after the adrenaline wore off, and the fact that he could time something so perfectly leaves me a little unnerved. But I stayed with one of my brothers until my parents got back from their trip, so luckily I didn't have to be there alone again.